In the annals of the 18th century, an era of enlightened monarchs and burgeoning ideas, lies a story that seems incredible. It's the tale of a man who, despite owning nothing, managed to deceive an entire continent by exploiting its vanity and political ambitions. Stefan Zannovich. His name is rarely found in textbooks today, yet it once echoed through courts and salons from St. Petersburg to Paris. He was merely the son of an Orthodox priest from a small Montenegrin village, a man without lineage, fortune, or any prospects beyond the most humble. But he possessed an extraordinary gift of persuasion and unparalleled audacity. He was a self-made man, crafting a myth around himself as a forgotten Albanian prince, heir to an ancient yet oppressed lineage. Boldly traveling through capitals, he presented himself alternately as a count or an envoy from exotic lands, gaining the trust of kings, empresses, and bankers. He borrowed vast sums, promised the impossible, and proposed insane political alliances. He became the self-proclaimed Prince of Albania, a figure around whom diplomatic intrigues simmered and fabulous sums of money revolved. But every grand adventure has its shelf life. Sooner or later, the truth finds its way out. The inevitable happened. His audacious game ended in the gloomy dungeons of a Venetian prison, where he is believed to have met his ignominious end. Forget the romantic image of a tragic hero or a misunderstood genius. Stefan Zannovich was nothing more than a masterful swindler, an unscrupulous con artist whose life was not an epic of a struggle for freedom, but a cold, calculated criminal drama of unprecedented scale. Zanovich was born in a remote area where life was dictated by harsh mountain climate and centuries-old traditions, rather than open horizons. The son of a humble Orthodox priest from a small Montenegrin village, he grew up in a world where the future seemed predetermined, and social mobility was either non-existent or broken. It was an environment where ambitions exceeding communal boundaries were seen as eccentricity or even sin. But for young Stefan, such limitations became not a source of resignation, but a boiling point. One can only imagine how, in a young soul burdened by a lack of prospects and perhaps a feeling of insignificance, a burning desire to break free from this humble predestination was born. There was no evidence of deep trauma, but the mere existence in conditions where a person with an unusual mind and boundless energy could not realize their potential might have become the very continuous frustration that pushes one to extreme measures. It was likely in this stifling atmosphere that his unique talent developed, not only for deception, but also for instantly assessing others' weaknesses. He saw how easy it was to manipulate hopes and fears, how simple it was to play on vanity. Perhaps his initial, still innocent attempts at mystification were merely a way to cope with an unbearable reality, a game that allowed him to be anyone but who he truly was. But at some point, this game ceased to be just an escape. It became a weapon. The turning point, the point of no return, was likely his first venture beyond his native mountains, when he encountered the brilliance and opportunities of the wider world. Where others sought honest work or patronage, Zanovich saw only a stage for his grand performance. He quickly understood. If reality didn't offer him what he desired, he would create his own. His lineage, his origin, his future, all became pliable material that he molded at will. He didn't just deceive others, he seemed to have convinced himself of his own fabricated exceptionalism, shedding the last vestiges of his former self. It was then, when he first presented himself as a non-existent prince, that he definitively crossed the line, transforming from an ambitious youth into the masterful architect of his own incredible lie. The 18th century, for all its enlightened rhetoric, remained an era deeply entrenched in pragmatic power politics, where grand ambitions often overshadowed common sense. Europe was a simmering cauldron of rival empires, each eager to expand its borders, solidify influence, and weaken adversaries. Dynastic marriages, secret treaties, and open wars were the instruments wielded by monarchs like Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great, and Maria Theresa, as they wove intricate webs of intrigue. Against this backdrop, the Balkans, situated at the crossroads of Ottoman, Austrian, and Russian imperial interests, became a geopolitical nexus where any spark could ignite a conflagration. Here, amidst constant struggles for territory and spheres of influence, the emergence of a new, even fictitious figure could appear not as madness, but rather as a strategic opportunity. Europe's financial system, though developing, remained vulnerable to large-scale manipulation. Banking houses, which financed wars and colonial ventures, dealt with immense sums, but often relied on rumors and reputation. Creditors, eager for high returns, were willing to take risks, investing in exotic projects or supporting forgotten monarchs if it promised political dividends or fabulous interest rates. The lack of centralized databases, slow information exchange, and reliance on personal recommendations created ideal conditions for those skilled at exploiting human greed and the desire for easy wealth. And finally, the social atmosphere. High society, weary of the monotony of court life, sought novelty and excitement. The salons of Paris, London, and St. Petersburg were open to anyone who could offer an engaging story, exotic origins, or enticing political prospects. Titles and outward splendor often mattered more than real accomplishments. The age of Enlightenment, which brought faith in reason and progress, paradoxically also gave rise to a fascination with hoaxes and an interest in secret societies. People were willing to believe the incredible if it was grand enough and aligned with their own ambitions or prejudices. In this world, where facts often yielded to impression and truth drowned in a flood of rumors, Stefan Zannovich found not just an audience, but accomplices in his grand theatrical production. He didn't invent deception. He merely brilliantly exploited existing cracks in the foundation of European society. Zanovich masterfully executed his grand deception. At the beginning of his dazzling career, likely in the fertile ground of Italian cities, he didn't just call himself the Prince of Albania. He became him in the eyes of the European elite. He meticulously constructed his legend, drawing inspiration from real historical figures and ancient lineages, inventing details of his exile and struggle. His appearance in society salons was an event. He spoke several languages, quoted classical authors, and demonstrated profound knowledge of politics and genealogy, giving the impression of a man of outstanding intellect and noble birth. His initial loans were likely modest, sums that served as an investment in his reputation, allowing him to maintain a lifestyle befitting a prince and expand his network. He didn't beg. He offered future political and commercial benefits, playing on the greed and ambitions of his interlocutors. He promised access to Albania's untold riches, gold, silver, trade routes, as soon as his legitimate rights were restored. This stage was the foundation upon which he built his subsequent, far more ambitious castles in the air. As his fabricated status solidified, Zanovich's horizons expanded, and his ambitions grew. One of his most audacious and financially successful ventures was a series of operations in the Netherlands, Europe's financial hub. Here, in Amsterdam and The Hague, he found fertile ground among wealthy bankers and merchants eager for new revenue streams. Presenting himself not merely as an exiled prince, but as an influential intermediary capable of opening the gates to the Balkans and the Middle East for Dutch trade, Zanovich skillfully played on their desire for monopolies and exorbitant profits. He promised exclusive concessions for precious metal mining in his domains, guarantees of safe passage through his territories for trade caravans, and even shares in future state loans of liberated Albania. To lend weight to his words, he presented forged letters from European monarchs, counterfeit bills of exchange, and even fabricated maps indicating untold riches. Dutch financiers, blinded by the prospect of fabulous gains, and perhaps flattered by the prince's attention, granted him astronomical sums, tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of florins. These funds, ostensibly for raising an army or diplomatic expenses, vanished without a trace into Zanovich's pockets, replenishing his personal coffers while he lived lavishly, maintaining the image of a powerful, albeit temporarily dethroned, ruler. Not content with financial schemes, Zanovich aimed for something grander, real influence on the European political stage. His next move led him to the court of King Gustav III of Sweden, an ambitious monarch prone to adventures. Sweden at that time sought ways to strengthen its international position, and the figure of an Albanian prince capable of instigating a revolt against the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans seemed an enticing tool for Gustav to achieve his geopolitical objectives. Zanovich arrived in Stockholm, already possessing a reputation as a man with extensive connections and access to certain secret Balkan forces. He offered the Swedish court not merely a military alliance, but a plan to destabilize the Ottoman Empire, promising to create a hotbed of rebellion at its very heart that would divert the Porte from European affairs and weaken its influence. He claimed to possess vast resources and the support of the local population, ready to take up arms at his signal. Under the guise of preparing for this grand operation, Zanovich convinced Swedish officials to allocate substantial funds to him, ostensibly for purchasing weapons, equipment, and bribing Turkish pashas. He even presented his officers and envoys from Albania, who were in reality fellow con artists hired by him to maintain the charade. This foray into high politics not only allowed him to secure new financial injections, but also elevated his status to that of an influential player whose actions could alter the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Zanovich didn't just know how to deceive. He was a masterful psychologist, actor, and director of his own show, where every gesture and word served a single purpose: to convince. His true genius lay not in the scale of his fiction, but in the finely honed precision of his personal tools of influence. Possessing phenomenal charisma, he literally mesmerized his interlocutors. His manners were impeccable, his speech refined, and his gaze penetrating. He could sustain conversations for hours on any topic, from ancient philosophy to the latest political gossip, creating the impression of a man of encyclopedic knowledge and noble birth. This erudition, bolstered by self-confidence and the ability to listen, created an aura of trust and exclusivity around him. He didn't just speak, he proclaimed, imbuing every word with the weight of truth. But charisma alone was not enough. Zanovich intuitively understood the deeper motivations of his victims. He didn't just play on greed, promising fabulous profits from non-existent mines or trade routes. He masterfully manipulated vanity, offering his creditors and patrons not merely money, but a share in history, in grand political projects that could reshape the map of Europe. Everyone who invested in the Prince of Albania felt themselves to be not just a banker, but a secret architect of a new world order, an accomplice in a grand game. Zanovich knew how to create a sense of exclusivity, convincing each person that they were chosen for a unique opportunity, unavailable to others. To lend tangible reality to his legend, Zanovich employed an entire network of agents and envoys. These were not mere accomplices, but carefully selected actors, each playing their part, from loyal officers to secret emissaries from Balkan lands. They corroborated his fabricated origins, told poignant tales of his exile and struggle, creating an entire retinue around him that enhanced the impression of a real prince's presence. Forged documents, letters with fake monarch seals, fabricated bills of exchange, invented genealogical trees, served as undeniable proof of his status. He didn't just forge papers, he created entire archives that seemed to corroborate every aspect of his incredible biography. These elements combined formed an impenetrable wall of plausibility, behind which any possibility of verification was lost. His incredible adaptability was key to his survival in this world of lies. Zanovich instantly changed masks. From a refined courtier, he transformed into a stern warrior. From a profound philosopher, into a pragmatic politician. He was fluent in several languages, switching between them effortlessly, and knew how to adapt to the cultural nuances of each country and every salon fate led him to. This flexibility allowed him not only to avoid exposure, but also to constantly evolve his methods, learning from mistakes and perfecting each new deception. He was a chameleon who not only blended into his surroundings, but actively shaped them to his needs, turning every encounter into another scene of his endless theatrical performance. Stefan Zannovich was not a product of circumstances. He was their creator, a genius of manipulation who utilized the full arsenal of human weaknesses to achieve his goals. Behind the grand spectacle Zanovich orchestrated stood not only his victims but also those who, consciously or unconsciously, became accomplices, fueling his ventures with their own ambitions. European monarchs, engrossed in geopolitical chess, saw him not as an impostor, but as a potential tool for destabilizing the Ottoman Empire or enhancing their influence in the Balkans. Their support was pragmatic. They viewed him merely as a disposable instrument, ready to be cast aside once his usefulness was exhausted or the risks outweighed the benefits. They granted him audiences and even funds, but kept him at arm's length, ready to disavow him at any moment should exposure loom. Financial magnates from Amsterdam to Vienna also found their advantage in Zanovich. They craved fabulous profits from the non-existent mines and trade routes he promised. Their greed clouded their judgment, turning any suspicions into minor details against the backdrop of promises of untold riches. They were willing to overlook his dubious origins if it promised unheard-of interest rates and monopolies on trade flows. For high society, Zanovich was an exotic diversion, a source of rumors and thrills capable of alleviating the boredom of court life. They reveled in his stories, his charm, his promises, seeing in him not a swindler but a mysterious, almost mythical figure whose presence lent a special luster to their salons. However, as his web of deception expanded, more people began to harbor doubts. Not everyone fell for his tricks, and some of his early investors had already begun to feel the sting of unfulfilled promises. Gradually, rumors about his true origins, unpaid debts, and vanished money began to multiply. European courts, initially interested, started to exercise caution, and diplomats and spies working for various powers began compiling dossiers on the enigmatic prince. The main antagonist in this story, the one who ultimately pulled the strings and put an end to his audacious procession, proved to be the Republic of Venice. For Venice, a maritime power whose trade routes and political influence directly depended on stability in the Adriatic and the Balkans, any figure capable of causing chaos or disrupting the balance of power posed a direct threat. The self-proclaimed Prince of Albania, with his promises of uprisings and territorial redivision, was not merely an amusing, eccentric, but a potentially dangerous, destabilizing element capable of undermining their interests in the region. Venice possessed one of the most developed intelligence networks in Europe, and its agents were known for their ruthlessness and efficiency. They were not susceptible to the same greed or desire for exoticism as monarchs or bankers. Their interests were clearly pragmatic, protecting trade routes, suppressing piracy, and maintaining order in their domains. Therefore, when Zanovich, after yet another financial scheme, found himself on their territory, the Venetian authorities did not hesitate. They initiated a systematic investigation, gathering evidence, interrogating witnesses, and correlating facts that others might have chosen to ignore. The Venetian doges and their Council of 10 saw through his game, understanding that behind the prince's mask was merely an unscrupulous adventurer whose activities threatened their interests. They did not seek a political ally or a source of wealth in him. They saw him as a criminal who needed to be stopped. This cold, calculated pragmatism of Venice proved fatal for Stefan Zannovich, for it was precisely what stripped him of any opportunity for another maneuver or escape. The ruthless and precise Venetian intelligence left Zanovich no chance to continue his brilliant deception. They didn't wait for him to make another mistake. They systematically set a trap, using his own overconfidence against him. Perhaps he himself, blinded by previous successes, underestimated the Doge's methodical approach, believing he could charm or bribe them too. He arrived in Venice, likely with another grand scheme concerning trade or political intrigues in the Balkans, confident in his invulnerability. But this time, the air around him thickened, and every meeting, every new contact, only hastened the inevitable. In early autumn of 1777, when the lagoon still held summer's warmth and the canals teemed with gondolas, Stefan Zannovich was arrested. This occurred not in a lavish palace where he was accustomed to dazzling, but in a modest inn where he had arrived under an assumed name. The arrest was swift and without fuss, almost professionally routine, which was likely his first shock. He was taken to the infamous Piombi prison, located beneath the lead roof of the Doge's palace, a place from which few emerged with their sanity or freedom intact. Here, within the gloomy walls where neither his charisma nor his false titles held sway, the process of his ultimate exposure began. Venetian investigators, known for their composure, did not fall for his tricks. They did not seek confessions but methodically gathered facts. In their hands were already numerous spy reports, complaints from defrauded creditors in Holland and Sweden, and the results of their own investigative work. Every forged document he had ever used, from letters of monarchs to bills of exchange for astronomical sums, now served as irrefutable proof of his crimes. The counterfeit seals, once so convincing, were meticulously examined and declared fakes. His agents and envoys, confronted with the harsh reality of Venetian justice, quickly gave testimonies, revealing the full extent of his theatrical production. Zanovich, accustomed to being the director of his own life, found himself on a stage where roles had been assigned without his input. His attempts to play the role of a noble martyr or political conspirator shattered against the stone walls and the indifferent faces of his interrogators. Before them sat not a prince, nor an heir to an ancient lineage, but an ordinary man cornered by his own lies. His legend, meticulously constructed over years, crumbled before their eyes, revealing his true origins. The son of a priest from a remote Montenegrin village, a man without title or fortune. News of his arrest and subsequent exposure quickly spread across Europe, causing a wave of shock and indignation. Those who had invested vast sums in him felt not merely deceived, but humiliated. Monarchs who had considered him a potential tool quickly distanced themselves, claiming they had never taken him seriously. High society, previously charmed by his exoticism, now discussed him with contempt, turning their former idol into an object of ridicule. His Principality of Albania definitively became a phantom, and his name became synonymous with grand deception. Stefan Zannovich, who had so skillfully created illusions, was finally stripped of his main magic, the belief in his fiction. Zanovich's arrest and the subsequent exposure of his fabrication struck Europe not merely as a scandal, but as a powerful financial and political blow. Bankers in Amsterdam, The Hague, and Vienna, blinded by promises of fabulous profits, discovered that their investments in the Albanian prince had turned to smoke. Tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of florins, guilders, and thalers issued to Zanovich against non-existent mines and trade monopolies were irrevocably lost. Several major Dutch financial houses found themselves on the brink of bankruptcy or incurred colossal losses, forced to urgently restructure their obligations. Private investors who had poured their last savings into this historic project were ruined, their hopes of quick enrichment shattered. For European monarchs who initially saw Zanovich as a potential instrument, his exposure brought equally serious consequences. Swedish King Gustav III, whose court had allocated significant funds to Zanovich for preparing a Balkan uprising, faced public humiliation. The Swedish government was forced to acknowledge the loss of large sums intended for geopolitical operations, which sparked a wave of criticism and called into question the acumen of the monarch and his advisors. Similarly, any other courts that had contact with Zanovich rushed to disavow him, proclaiming their complete non-involvement and that they never took him seriously. However, reputational damage was done. Trust in foreign policy initiatives and the court's ability to vet their counterparties was undermined. On Europe's financial market, shaken by this colossal swindle, a period of heightened caution began. Bankers and creditors began demanding more thorough vetting of borrowers' origins and trustworthiness, especially those offering exotic projects with unrealistic promises. The slow exchange of information, which had previously played into the hands of adventurers, was now perceived as a serious drawback, stimulating attempts to establish more timely communication between financial centers. Zanovich's case became a textbook example of how easily the greed and political ambitions of the elite could be manipulated, highlighting the vulnerability of the system at the time to large-scale fraud. This grand deception clearly demonstrated that even in the age of Enlightenment, which proclaimed the triumph of reason, human vices and institutional gaps remained fertile ground for the most audacious ventures. However, Stefan Zanovich's story did not conclude in the dungeons of a Venetian prison, becoming a mere file on fraud. On the contrary, his figure, despite complete exposure, paradoxically achieved a peculiar immortality, becoming part of collective memory, but in an entirely different light. Over time, the scandalous details of his criminal genius began to fade, giving way to a more romanticized image. He became not just a swindler, but a symbol of incredible audacity, a man who dared to challenge the established order using only his intellect and boundless imagination. This phenomenon is no accident. The human mind is prone to hero worship, even if the hero builds their path on lies. The grandeur of his scheme, the scale of deception that enveloped all of Europe, made his story too captivating to be confined to the category of a mere crime. In popular memory, and later in some historical retellings, Zanovich transformed into a kind of Robin Hood, albeit without noble motives, or a Prometheus who stole fire from the gods, in this case money and trust from the powerful. His biography, devoid of genuine achievements, became embellished with myths of an indomitable spirit, of an individual's struggle against the system. The paradox of his legacy lies in the fact that a man utterly devoid of genuine identity, who created himself from pure fiction, ultimately left behind a real, albeit distorted, legend. His story, seemingly meant to be a warning about the perils of deception, instead became a testament to the enduring human craving for the miraculous, for tales of those who, against all odds, achieved the impossible. We, as observers and descendants, involuntarily admire his audacity, his acting prowess, his ability to make entire states believe in his phantom principality. The universal lesson Stefan Zanovich's story offers us is that society, however enlightened, always remains vulnerable to compelling fiction. It's a reminder of how easily greed, vanity, or even a simple desire for entertainment can overshadow rationality. Zanovich was no hero, but his story continues to live on, not because it is true, but because it resonates with our own inclination towards illusions, our belief in the impossible, and perhaps a secret wish for someone to outsmart the system. He became less a historical figure and more an archetype, an eternal reminder of the fine line between reality and fantasy, and that sometimes the most incredible lies prove to be the most enduring.